What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Coding Central, and this is the very first video of another tutorial series that is Kotlin for Java developers. Now if you go to YouTube and search for Kotlin tutorials, you will find a lot of tutorials out there, but the thing is almost all of those tutorials are focused for absolute beginners. And when you watch a beginner's tutorial, they explain every single thing, like all those core concepts: what is a variable, what is object-oriented programming, what is char, what is integer, what is string, and all those things. But if you already have some programming knowledge in Java or other language, you already know those stuff. So it's kind of like, I don't really want to watch the concepts again. I just need to know the difference in syntax. And that's why I created this entire playlist. In this playlist, I will be showing you the differences in syntax, the Kotlin way of doing stuff, and what are the best practices, what are some practices that you can avoid, and all those things. But at the same time, I will be explaining some of the new concepts that Kotlin brought and not available in Java. So yeah, we'll be doing all those things. So stick around, and if you're new to this channel, please subscribe. That will help this channel to grow, and you won't miss these awesome videos. All right, so let's actually get started now. So I have my file opened here in IntelliJ IDEA, and of course you can have it anywhere you want as long as you have Kotlin compiler installed. All right, so let me just go ahead and create my main function. So main, there you go. Okay, now you might be thinking, hold on, Fi, something's illegal there. You are not using a main class. And of course this main function is kind of like the public static void main you have in Java. But in Kotlin, we don't need to have every single function in class. Kotlin allows you to write something called a top level function. Now top level functions are basically functions that you can just create a file and start writing the functions. You don't need a class for every single thing. But of course that does not mean Kotlin does not have object-oriented programming. It does, and we'll be taking a look at those in the future videos. But for now, just keep in mind that you can write functions outside of a class. That's kind of important concepts here. That is what you call a top level functions. All right, and also at the same time, we don't have something called static in Kotlin. Kotlin does not have anything like static, so you only have function here. It's kind of like the public static void main we have in Java, but we don't need the function, and also you don't have the the string array argument that we had before. But of course you can add that if you want to. You can say something like string, and we can say args, and we can have that. But it's giving me a warning here. We don't need that explicitly. If you don't use that, you can just omit that. Yeah, Kotlin allows you to use that. All right. Okay, now let's actually get started with printing, because if you don't print hello world, you are not a programmer. Don't call yourself a programmer. So how do I print hello world? Well, you can do the old Java way, that is the system dot, I need to spell system correctly, so system dot out dot print, and now you can write hello world, and of course this will work. But as you can see, the IDE is actually complaining here and saying that you don't need to write all those stuff. You can just write print and it will just work. And why will it work? That's because if I go to print, it's nothing but a function that calls out system.out.print, and print is actually a top level function. And if you create a top level function in Kotlin, you can access it from anywhere in your package. All right, and as it is a library function and a top level function, we can access print directly. We don't need to explicitly type system.out.print. And of course I will be explaining all this inline and other stuff in the function part. But for now, just keep in mind that we can print just by typing print or println. All right, so that's kind of the printing. Now let's actually move over to another important concept, that is variable. All right, so variables. How do we create variables in Kotlin? Well, in Java we use this format here. So we write the type of the variable, then we give the name, and then we equals, and then the variable value. That's how we are used to. But in Kotlin, we start with the keyword called var, and that stands for variable. All right, and then of course we give the name of the variable, and I'm gonna call it value, and then we use a colon to dictate the type of this variable. So it's gonna be of type integer. Now of course you might have noticed it already, that is I'm using a capital I here for the integer naming here. And that's because in Kotlin we don't have anything called primitive variables. We don't have small int, small double, and anything like that. We only have capital int, capital double, capital char, all those things. We don't have primitive variables. But don't worry about performance issues, because the compiler will automatically convert it to primitive variables when necessary. And I kind of like this approach here. Every single thing starts with a capital character now, and that's kind of good, because in Java we if we wanted to create a string, we had the capital S, but for integer we needed to write that small in I, and this is kind of like good for beginners. You start writing every single type with a capital letter. Alright, so that's how we create a variable of type integer. Now of course I'm getting some errors here, actually some warnings here, and the warning here is Kotlin is telling me that you don't need to explicitly give me the type of this variable, and that's because Kotlin has something called type inference built into the compiler. So compiler will try to infer the type of the variable from its value, and you don't need to explicitly provide that. So I can just come over here and omit this integer entirely, and it will still work. And if I go over here and hit Ctrl Q, you can see that it's of type integer. But of course we can, if we need a long, we can use the 5L, of course a capital L, not a small l over there, and it is now of type L. We can even use like 5.6, and that's of course is of type double, and if we use the F here, it's of type float. Alright, so Kotlin can infer the value from, Kotlin can infer the type of the variable from its values, and that I think can help you a lot. But of course that's something, and not to mention that I can now, if I just use a 5 here, okay, and now I can come over here and say value equals 7. I can do that. I can change the variable's values, and that's kind of good. Now let's go ahead and actually print it. Print value. Right, if we print it, we can get the result. Well, this works, but you can see that the ID is complaining me again and saying that this variable is never modified. So it's kind of nice if you use an immutable type. Now in Java we are used to the final keyword, we'll create immutable variables. In Kotlin we don't have anything called final. The final keyword is not present in Kotlin. Instead we have something called val or value, and when you use var or variable, you can change the values later on, but when you use value or val, you can't. That's immutable type. Right now if I come over here and say value equals 7, it won't let me change it. Right, so that's one thing. And of course I forgot to show you one more thing, that is semicolon in Kotlin is optional. You can use a semicolon, omit a semicolon, and your program will work just as fine. And the reason behind it is that you can start a social word that whether you should use it or not. All right, so yeah, that's semicolon. You can use it or not, up to you. So that's kind of how we create variables, and of course we can also create variables of type string here. So if I hit Ctrl Q again, it's of type string again. All right, that's how you create variables. So that's all nice. Now there are actually a lot of variables out there, so go to kotlin.lang, check all of those variables. It's actually not possible for me to actually show you all of those, right? So yeah, so that's how we create single variables. Now we can also, Kotlin also have the concept of arrays and lists. So if we have something like an array, and we can create an array, and we create array with a top level function called array of, and if we pass in some values, it creates an array for us. Even if we go to array of function takes a variable argument, and we'll check it later on when we go to functional part. So it takes variable arguments and it returns an array. All right, so and of course it infers the type, and as you can see it's of type array integer, but we did not explicitly mention that because Kotlin has type inference built in. Okay, and at the same time it also has list, so I can say list equals, and again I can use the function called list of, and I can pass 3, 4, 5. We can do that, and again it will infer the type. However, if I want to create an empty list, we have to provide the type, right? So because there's no way it can infer the type there, so we can actually provide the type over there. So it's kind of nice. And if I just create some variable, create a and if I just create a list here, now if I want to modify this list to something like list of 4, 5, 6, and of course I need to use a var here. Well, I can do that, right? But notice one thing, that if I want to now list.add, that method is not present here, and that's because by default all of those functions creates immutable list. That means you cannot change that list after you create it. But however, if you want to create mutable, you can use the mutable list of function to create, well, mutable list here. And now you can have that add function here, and now you can now go ahead and add a variable. So Kotlin kind of like promotes immutability. It does not enforce you to use it, but it kind of like promotes it, right? So try to use immutable variables wherever you can, and change to mutable variable only if you need to, right? And another cool thing about this list object here, if I create another list here, so called list2, and it's a list of let's say 1, 2, 3, and of course those are the same variable, those are the same values. Now in Java, if we write something like list equals list2, that would give us a false, because in Java by default it does the pointer comparison. In Kotlin, however, you can actually specify whether you want to do pointer comparison or data comparison with the help of data class and other. We'll take a look at those, but for now, just to show you, it's kind of a nice thing. If you do that, it says true because it actually checks each of the individual element and not just a pointer. All right, so that's kind of the variables. And aside from arrays and list, Kotlin also have another variable type that is called a range. So I'll create a range real quick just to show you. It's kind of like a list, but it isn't. Let me just show you. So to create a range, we start by the starting point of the range, and then we use 2 dot, and then we give the ending point of the range, and that's kind of a list of 1 to 10, right? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And just to show you what we mean here, we can use the for each function here, and we can say print. By the way, we'll take a look at each of those higher order functions and whatnot. We'll take a look at them in the functional part. And of course I can print it, and it prints 1, 2, 3, 4 and all those stuff. You know it, right? So it does that. So we have also this new variable type here called range. It's kind of like a list, but slightly different, and I'll be explaining it later on. But for now, this is how you can create a list of integers real quick, right? That's one thing. Now, and of course you can again go to kotlin.lang to learn more about all those variables Kotlin has, and I think you should take a look at variable types and whatnot, because in this video is all about like showing you what are the benefits of some variables, the syntaxes, and some of the things that you should avoid. And speaking of which, let's talk about null ability. Now in Kotlin, you might actually have heard that Kotlin is something like a null safe language, or it got rid of the null pointer exception, which is of course not true. You cannot do that. We cannot like just get rid of the null pointer exception. That's not possible, because with our old Java habits in mind, we need to work with null values, right? So let's actually go ahead and just to show you what I mean, I'll create a variable here. I'll call it hello, and I will of course create a variable of type string. Now if I hit Ctrl Q, it tells me that it's a variable of type string. Now let me just go here and set the value of hello to null. Now I'm getting an error here, and that's because if I hover over it, it says that you cannot use null for a non-nullable value, and that's because by default every single variable you create in Kotlin is not nullable. So Kotlin tries to move away from this null pointer exception, and it kind of like provides a better way of handling this null pointer exception that all of us go crazy about. But at the same time, of course, we might need to use nullable types. So how do we do that? How do we create variables that can be set to null in Kotlin? Well, we start by giving this variable a type. So we explicitly say that it's of type string, and then we use a question mark, and question mark just now allows us to set this variable to null. Okay, that's kind of cool. But of course, in Kotlin, like I said, it tries to move away from this concept of null, because what's the point of having null if we have to do if not null every single place we use it? That's kind of like the main idea behind going null safe. Now let me just go ahead and print something here. Print hello.length, which prints out the length of string. Now of course in Java, if we were to run this function, it will compile just perfectly, but at some point it would just crash because some place in my code I used a null for our hello variable here, and it would just crash. It would cause runtime exception and our program will crash. In Kotlin, however, it gives me a compile time exception. It forces me to handle this null value before I can execute any command based on it, right? So now I'm getting a compiler error here, and it's basically saying that this variable hello here can be null at some point in the future, so you must handle it. So how do we handle it? Well, we have the old Java way, that is, again, Kotlin was inspired by many languages including Java, so it has a lot of syntax similar to Java. So we use if statement exactly how we used in Java. So we can say hello, if hello not equals null, and now of course it doesn't give me an error because it is sure that it won't be null at this point of execution. We can do that, but of course Kotlin provides a shorter way of doing it, that's the Elvis operator, and that's basically the same question mark we used here. We can place it after hello, and that basically does the same thing. It says that if this variable is not null, execute this entire command. That's kind of a shorter way of doing it, and I think it's more comprehensive at the same time. All right, so yeah, that's there, but I also need to show you some other thing here about null. Now if this variable is local, now I want to change it to global variable, and now you can see I'm still getting an error. Even if I'm checking that hello is not equals null, I'm still getting an error, and that's because of multi-threading issues. Now Kotlin of course allows you to have multi-thread and all those asynchronous programming, and it's basically saying here that you can still run into a null pointer exception. How so? Let's say at this point hello is not null, but exactly here when the compiler comes to at this point of time, another thread comes in and makes that variable a null, and of course it's a global variable, so any thread can access it, and that makes it null, and so we can still run into null pointer exception. So Kotlin kind of says that okay, don't do that, instead use a Elvis operator, and Elvis operator takes care of even of multi-threading. So you don't need to explicitly make that for volatile, use synchronized keyword and all those crazy stuff. You don't need to do that. You can just use a question mark operator there, and the compiler takes care of it in the background. All right, so that's kind of magic in Kotlin does. Okay, so that's null ability in Kotlin. So the main idea behind non-nullable variable is that try not to use nullable variables, try to use default variables instead. But of course sometimes in our projects we need to create a variable that we don't know the type of, right? So I have my variable, we don't know the value, sorry. So, and let's say it's of type string, and I don't want to specify a value right now. I want to give this value later on in my code, but at the same time I don't want to make it nullable. Kotlin actually has a keyword for that, and it's called lateInit. LateInit is basically called late initialize, so I'm not providing this value now, but it's also not null, right? So it's also not nullable, so you cannot set this value, set this variable to null, but at the same time this value is kindly empty. That's kind of like an intermediate state right there. So if I now go ahead and print something like my variable dot length, it will run, but now it will actually give me a runtime exception, and that of course is not null pointer exception, but it is called uninitialized property access exception. And of course you cannot like just handle that. You can actually handle that something like with this thing with double quotation, my variable dot is initialized. You can check that like that, right? But the good thing about it is you probably want to initialize lateInit variables in your main method. So I can say my variable equals hello, and now we are all done. There's no way we can get another exception for this variable in the future, and of course not to mention that we cannot set it to null anywhere. Okay, so that's there. So if I now run it, it works. Okay, so that's kind of like the concept of lateInit variable and null variable. So the main idea again is, and yes, I'm emphasizing it because it's kind of important thing about Kotlin, try to move away from null. Okay, now, and of course I actually forgot to show you one more thing. So let me just create my variable again, var hello of type string. we'll make it nullable and we'll say it hello. Okay, and now if I want to print hello dot length, now beside the Elvis operator that I showed you, the question mark operator, we also have something called a double exclamation here, so we can use that, and that's basically saying that I guarantee you, that's basically an assertion operator, so I assert that this value will never be null, right? And that's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. Don't do that, please don't do that. Instead use the Elvis operator. That's kind of like the recommended way of doing it, because you never know. You can actually do that for local variables, like here it's cool, because I know that multi-thread won't be an issue here. Actually it can be an issue here, so yeah. Sorry, excuse me. Always use the Elvis operator, that's the bottom line, right? But if you're certain that this variable it can never be null, you can use an assertion operator there. But the recommended way again is to use the question mark operator. All right, so that's kind of the concept of null ability. That's kind of the concept of null legitimate variable. Now let's take a look at another concept that's called type alias. Now type alias is kind of a way of giving an existing variable a new name, a variable type a new name. So for example, I can have a variable type called username, and it's of type string. So here I'm basically saying that wherever I use the variable type username, the compiler has to change it to string. So let's create a variable here called name, and it will be of type username, and I call it hello. Actually no, 5, and that's there, right? Now type alias is there to give your code more semantics. Now because this name is now more explicit, whoever comes and read this knows that this is going to be a username for something, right? So that's kind of it provides more expressiveness in your code, so you can use type alias for those purposes. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea behind all those variables and other stuffs. But of course, go to kotlin.lang and look over some more variables you have. Do that, and yeah, that's it for today, and I'll see you in the next video.